Hello, welcome to Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today we have Dr. Ann Bonds, assistant professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thank you for coming here today, Ann.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful that you're here. And like other people that are geographers, we oftentimes are curious about what inspired them to get into the field and reflect on childhood, perhaps, as if there was some evidence of a childhood activity, parents, or something that occurred that struck you to go into geography eventually.
Well, I'm kind of one of those accidental geographers. I didn't really discover the discipline of geography for myself. I mean, of course I knew about it, but I didn't do geographic studies until graduate school. It was one of these instances where, you know, I started in economics and then moved into women's studies and then was working with the geographer Jan Monk, and I discovered geography that way, and it was kind of like,
brilliant
this
geographer.
this is what I've been looking for, where I can, you know, ask these questions about, you know, economics and political economy and social inequality, and it just really clicked for me. So I went on and did my PhD. But my father has training in geography. He's managed state parks in Wyoming, and so I always grew up with you know, an appreciation for public space and you know, thinking about the environment. So that was kind of a constant in my childhood, but didn't necessarily ever imagine that I would be. I mean, if you would have told me I would have been an academic geographer, you know, 20 years ago, I would have thought it was a big joke. But
Sure.
here I am, and you know, I'm very, very happy that I found it.
Well, that's a great story. It's interesting. Your father perhaps provided opportunities to give you some context without even saying, well, this is geography. And then when you encountered Jan Monk at the University of Arizona, the die was cast, and the rest is history. Right. You know, in terms of being mentored by Jan, do you recall any important attributes that she carried that inspired you to perhaps emulate her?
Yeah, I mean, so many actually. It's kind of hard to start. But what is really amazing about Jan is that she knows everybody and has such a desire to foster geographic thinking amongst lots of people, and so she's so interested in connecting people. Oh, well, if you're interested in this, you should talk to so-and-so, and making those introductions happen. So early on, I had the opportunity, because she was keen on introducing me to folks, to meet really wonderful scholars, which introduced me to, you know, a whole realm of thinking. I went from working with Jan, when she was president of the AAG, I was her research assistant, and I helped do some of the research that ended up being in her presidential address. And then I went to Washington, where I worked with Victoria Lawson, and was her RA when she was president of the AAG. And so, you know, through those experiences,
another brilliant geographer.
Right. I mean, I've been very, very lucky to have you know, these incredible mentors that are feminist mentors, looking explicitly to support women in geography. And so, you know, I try to emulate that, although, you know, these are very huge shoes to fill. So, but by, you know, really working closely with students, introducing the idea of graduate school to undergrads who may not have ever considered that option, and you know, really kind of teaching through example, incorporating students into research projects, because that's what both Vicki and Jan did for me, brought me into their research projects so that I could understand, okay, this is what research looks like. This is what geographic research, how it takes place. This is how publishing takes place. And so that, you know, that's what I aim to do.
That's wonderful. Well, so you moved on from Arizona to Washington, and was this a move that was encouraged by Jan then?
Yes. When I was applying to PhD programs, I applied to both women's studies programs and I applied to geography programs. And it was a tough decision. I had, I was lucky to get into some really exciting institutions, but I ultimately, took a gamble and went to Washington and decided to go geography, because I really thought, this was an area where I could do feminist work, but have a disciplinary focus, so that it wouldn't, necessarily, I could do the same things, but in a different disciplinary context.
And you were then indeed a geographer.
Right.
You called yourself a geographer.
Right. I had to do a little bit of catching up. In my first year, I took actually just did directed readings as a master's student. So my first year I was trying to catch up on a lot of geography.
I can well imagine. Washington has a unique program in a lot of ways because it is relatively eclectic, yet there are some very active, proactive feminist geographers, Victoria Lawson among them. And it seems to me that there is more of an emphasis in answering or seeking to answer the so what question, as opposed to perhaps describing a problem, presenting it. It seems to me that the program that you were involved in, the geographers that you're associated with, did much to bring meaning to the research. Is that a correct assumption in your eyes?
Yes, and that's a big part of why I went there, because it was really exciting to me to see that, as you said, there's a range of scholars, but there is a fairly coherent focus there on kind of political economy, feminist approaches, and that was a main focus that I wanted to take, but definitely a social justice orientation. So thinking about imagining and thinking about different sorts of worlds. And that's, you mentioned my childhood. I think that, growing up, one of the most important things that, happened for me that brought me to where I am is that I grew up in a family where questions of social inequality and politics were discussed at the kitchen table. They were a constant part of my childhood. And so social justice has always been a key part of my academic work, and I certainly found that in geography at Washington.
It's interesting. Many people don't realize that geography includes that social justice component, especially if we do seek to answer that so what question. We attempt to bring meaning to our work, and I guess some of us are successful, and you are one of them, as are your mentors. Tell us about your research when you were at Washington.
Well, I actually, when I started Washington, I was interested really in doing work on gendered labor markets. That's still an interest of mine. But at the time, I was interested in looking at call center work, and thinking about the way that there's a particular geography to this kind of occupation, but it's also very gendered, and it's all about gender performance. As I was starting to develop a dissertation project, I was home. I'm from Wyoming, and I was reading in a newspaper about a small town in Wyoming that was, trying to recruit a prison. They wanted a prison, and they were doing this for an economic development strategy. Of course, as I learned more about this, I found out that this is fairly commonplace and not new, but it really fascinated me, just a number of dimensions. That, how is it that this kind of project becomes palatable to communities, and what sorts of relationships is it based upon? And so I came back after, I think this was over spring break or something of the likes, and I said to Vicki, and I also worked closely with Lucy Giroux, I've got this idea. This is what I want to do. And at first they both thought, well, this is crazy. This is quite a significant shift. But it built closely into a project that they were working on, a rural poverty project. And we started, thinking about the connections between what I was envisioning and the work that they were doing on this NSF-funded grant. And so that's how kind of I really fell into this project. It took me into a new direction. And so this was a long time ago, and I'm still in that trajectory right now, although I've actually broadened. So that's how prisons and incarceration became a part of my research, and now I've been doing more thinking about people's experiences after prison, women's in particular, thinking about the neighborhood and community implications of incarceration. But what started me was this idea of, prisons as an economic development strategy.
Well, that's fascinating, really, because we do see that prisons are used across the country for economic development purposes. It's oftentimes in the news, and it appears that prisons generally are allocated more funding frequently than education, isn't it?
Increasingly so, and I think it's really a telling fact of our time that is the case. I think we all have to think carefully about the implications of, this kind of model that we're going to fund incarceration over education. And that's certainly the case now in Wisconsin. It wasn't so until a few years ago, but now, funding for the Department of Corrections exceeds funding for education in the state.
That's amazing, and I think it's a sad commentary on our society in many
Certainly.
ways, isn't it?
It is.
And so as you pursued this research with regard to prisons and noted the economic development aspects associated with it, you noted also that racism was a prevalent theme. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, yeah, certainly. The prisons aren't, randomly located. They're located predominantly in, white communities, although there is some more racial diversity in some of these rural communities. But there's a power at play. You have large prisons in predominantly white communities incarcerating communities of color, and that isn't even really a factor that many people discuss, the economic development representatives in these towns. It's kind of a taken for granted assumption. That's just the way it is. But also, what I began to see as I developed these projects, particularly in two case studies, which became really important in my dissertation research, one in Montana and one in Oregon, was that local racial politics also played into this broader racial picture of siting prisons in rural communities, so that understandings of race and local racial issues became a way to kind of to build ideological support in the community for these sorts of development projects, which was really fascinating and for me particularly surprising. I wasn't anticipating that when I arrived, that I would hear that local racial issues were being used to support this larger racial project.
It's interesting. It brings about a notion of behavioral attributes in a local community driving this type of development, really, in a lot of ways. And it may appear to be the behavioral attributes of a number of powerful individuals that fuel the politics, driving prison development, which more frequently now seems to be generating for-profit entities.
Right.
You've done much work then in incarceration. You did your work with the call centers, and it's fascinating in itself. You noted that women were generally preferred than men to work in call centers. And I've noted that myself, actually, when I talk to some call center personnel. The men tend not to receive the favorable responses that many of the women do. You've also done some work in Milwaukee with Habitat for Humanity. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, my colleague Judith Kinney and I have been interested in this. She's a housing scholar, and of course I've always been interested in community development. And so the two of us, were talking about the role of Habitat for Humanity, and we started looking around in the literature and saw that it's really nobody's really studied habitat. There are a few really key studies, but particularly in geography, Jason Hackworth has done some really interesting work, but geographers haven't really looked at habitat and their role in housing, nonprofit housing provision, but also in community development, because that really is the trajectory they're taking today. And so, we were interested in particular because the Milwaukee Habitat for Humanity is very, really active. They're very well known. They have a long history of working, and they actually produce quite a few houses. So we were interested in saying, okay, well, how many houses are being produced? what is the impact locally in Milwaukee, and understanding more about, their model of housing provision. And because I'm a scholar of race as well, and Milwaukee is a highly racialized, segregated city, their project has interesting racial implications as well, or their housing provision. They initially started in Milwaukee as a means to actually, during a period of white flight when lots of white folks were moving out of the city of Milwaukee, to have congregations come back and give back to low-income neighborhoods. And so we've been looking at some of their more recent projects, and how they have or have not engaged with local communities of color in their building strategies.
And has the impact been largely favorable or just uneven?
It's been fairly uneven. What's happened is, the strategy, they've tried to grow their building strategies and to target particular neighborhoods. And targeting particular neighborhoods has benefits. Quicker outcomes in transforming neighborhoods, and there's a whole range of reasons why they cluster in particular areas. But that also means that when they target certain areas, at the same time that other areas in the city might be neglected. They only have so many resources, and it takes a while to build a house. And it's a little bit cold in Milwaukee, so the building season is fairly limited. So they have to do it very quickly. So there's some interesting factors that shape how many houses they can actually build, and then the actual need for housing in Milwaukee, as in the case of most U.S. cities at this time. We have an enormous need for affordable housing. And so, the question is, if they're the main provider of nonprofit housing, where are other people getting supports, or how can they get into housing? Because there's an enormous waiting list for subsidized housing in the city.
I can well imagine. And so next on your agenda, in terms of your research focus, is this examination of former inmates that had been incarcerated, particularly with regard to women. What are you finding?
Well, a lot of what I'm finding, people know that it's incredibly difficult after people have come out of prison to find housing, to find work. And that's very difficult. Housing and work are the primary issues, particularly because if individuals have been convicted of a felony, then they have restrictions on the sorts of assistance they can get for subsidized housing once again, and employment. They must, in the state of Wisconsin, indicate that they have a felony record, which constrains their employment options. What's really interesting to me is that, the number of women, particularly women of color, Black women, who are being incarcerated is really growing rapidly. And a lot of the reentry services tend to be geared towards male incarceration. So there aren't as many services geared specifically towards women's needs, which are specific because 80% approximately of the women who have experienced incarceration in Wisconsin are mothers, and they are oftentimes facing different sorts of challenges when they come home. Not only seeking employment, housing, etc., trying to get back children from state custody, perhaps, caring for other family members. So I was really interested in understanding more about the gendered implications. And then, there's a very clear geography of incarceration, as there is in most places. But in Milwaukee, the areas that have high numbers of people who were formerly incarcerated or who are incarcerated tend to be those neighborhoods that have been devastated by other sorts of racial projects. Urban disinvestment, white flight, as I mentioned a moment ago, historical processes of redlining and highway building. These neighborhoods are, kind of represent a culmination of years and years and years of practices that have disinvested in them. So there aren't a lot of employment opportunities and opportunities to access jobs in other parts of the city.
So have you interviewed many women?
Yeah, the project is ongoing. So I'm still interviewing women, and I've also interviewed social service providers, particularly social service providers who are working with women, so they could share more about what they see and identify as the challenges, and then yes, with the women themselves. So hopefully we'll continue to talk to people over the next year.
Well, it's a very complex issue. There are no quick fixes here, for sure. Do you have students working on any research projects, theses, dissertations that you find particularly captivating?
Yes, I have currently 2 PhD students who are doing really fascinating work. Yui Hashimoto is doing a project on the fight for 15, particularly amongst fast food workers in Milwaukee. And it corresponds with the work that I've done because, you know, the vast majority, despite what people think about fast food workers, the vast majority are actually not high school kids. These aren't, you know, children or young people that are working, teenagers, as the stereotype is. These tend to be you know, adults that are trying to support families, and, you know, overwhelmingly, you know, people who are marginalized in other ways, socially and economically. So people of color, women, formerly incarcerated individuals. And so she's doing a really great project examining you know, the organizing in Milwaukee for a $15 minimum wage amongst fast food workers. I have another PhD student, Rebecca Knoll, who's doing a really interesting project on cooperative development, so worker cooperatives in particular. And her project looks at kind of racial and urban geographies. Cooperatives have been a strategy that Black communities have used for a long time as a means for community development. You know, when they've been, for example, excluded from other sorts of industries or businesses. So that's a means of really grassroots local development. But increasingly, it's becoming a popular model, and this is good, but it also raises a lot of questions. You know, when the cooperative model gets larger, when it's implemented by cities, like, for example, the city of New York, how does it retain that kind of economic and racial justice component, or does it? Can the model be transported to other geographic locations that are, you know, highly specific? And so she's just getting ready to begin her research, but it's a very interesting project.
It sounds like it. Do you, is there a list of items that you have in your mind, or maybe written down, that you wish to impart on your students in terms of, you know, this is what you probably wish to consider. These are the questions to ask in terms of engaging in geographical research.
That's a trickier one. I mean, I think it tends to be highly specific to the individuals. And generally, the students that are working with me, you know, we have very similar research interests. And so, you know, I tend to look for complementarity between the things that I'm working on, my expertise. But, you know, one of the things that I think the mentors that I worked with told me, and that, you know, I try to tell particularly PhD students, is, you know, to not imagine a dissertation as, you know, the end-all be-all. That this is a start in a research trajectory, and that you know, you have to keep it manageable, and committed to the work that you're interested in. You need to love it, but also know that this is just a start, and that, you know, labor market willing, you have, you know, opportunities in the future to continue to do, you know, much more research that builds on and expands the project. Because I know when I was a PhD student, there was this sense that, you know, I had to do it all. You know, I had to be in this place, and I needed to talk to these people. And, you know, it's really not feasible. When it comes right down to it, a dissertation.
Not in geography.
No. To do really in-depth geographic work and to really be true to a place and a community, it takes a lot of time.
It takes passion. And it should be fun. It should be something that one enjoys doing.
Right.
That's what I think, anyway.
Yeah.
And as far as your colleagues, you're a mother of 2 children. You're an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, a doctoral granting department in geography. You have a lot on your plate. How do you manage it all? Do you have suggestions for others that might be in your shoes?
You know, I think, again, geography is changing, and I think that there are more women in the discipline, and I think it is great that I'm in a department that, you know, there are a number of women in the department, there are families, and so there's a recognition and support of the kind of socially reproductive labor that has to happen in addition to the work that we do as academics. It is still a challenge, but, you know, I you know, would encourage students to, you know, chart their own paths and seek out mentors along the way to help them navigate their particular institutional environments. So it's a tricky one to answer, but yeah, I think that it is really great to be in a place where, in my department, I work with a lot of fantastic colleagues that recognize the importance of not only our academic research and our teaching, but also, our personal lives. But I do think we have to continue to work to support and cultivate that environment because, it can be easily pushed to the side.
It certainly can, and I guess one thing one must also learn, perhaps, is to get sleep when you can.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Well, Ann, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep.
This concludes today's session of Conversation with the Geographer. Thank you for spending this time with us.